Welcome to the Anxious Love Coach podcast, a place for creating meaningful, conscious, secure, long-term partnerships. Here, we talk relationship anxiety and creating healthy, magnetic dynamics within partnership to help you feel confident and alive within committed partnership. My name is Natalie Kennedy, and I'm your host. I'm a relationship anxiety coach and meditation teacher. I've worked with hundreds of clients battling anxiety, and after experiencing extraordinary shifts in my own healing relative to partnership, now combine my lived personal experience and professional training to help others trust themselves within relationship and in their lives. I've been to the edge and back with my now husband from relationship anxiety and come out confidently to the other side. I want to pass the tools I've learned along to you to help you trust yourself in relationships and also create magnetic, hot dynamics with your partner. I believe lots of mainstream relationship advice today can make us anxious and dissatisfied. So let's jump in and normalize challenges that modern relationships and real people go through while also giving you tools to trust yourself, drop the shame, and alchemize your messy, twisted relational truths into profound inner wisdom and aliveness. If you haven't yet, be sure to join my communities over on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Anxious Love Coach. You can also request a 30-minute relationship anxiety assessment with me depending on availability, or ask me a question over on my website at www.anxiouslovecoach.com. I've also got a wonderful relationship anxiety meditation available to you as thanks for subscribing to my email list. Thanks for being here and enjoy this episode. Hey, this is your girl Natalie, coming lazily straight onto her iPhone voice notes to let you know that I am currently on maternity leave in terms of podcasting, and that the episode that you're about to listen to is a replay based on some of my most popular episodes. I will probably not record any new podcasting content until May or June, so in the meantime, please enjoy some of these old episodes. Maybe you've never heard them before, or you've heard them, but you'll get something new out of it this time around. Please give me some grace in case there are some outdated offers or outdated stories, but I will also include some information at the very end of the episode for ways that you can still get support from me beyond this episode. I'm not going completely off the grid. I still plan to have smaller spaces where I share some things, so I'll share that with you at the very end of the episode. Thanks so much for understanding, and I hope you enjoy this recording. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. So nice to have you back. I had a Patreon call earlier this week, and someone asked a question about how to know if you're in a toxic relationship. And I answered it on Patreon, but I also thought it would be a really good idea to make a podcast on this topic because it's a really valid question, especially given the nature of a lot of things that I answer related to relationship anxiety. Often what you hear me say is, my stuff does not apply if you are in a toxic or an abusive relationship. And that is really helpful. What about for those of us who don't know, if it's not clear whether we're in a toxic relationship or not? This episode is for you. What if you have dynamics in your relationship that are so unsatisfying that it leads you to think that maybe you are in a toxic relationship and maybe this stuff that Natalie's saying doesn't actually apply? I'm going to address as much as I feel capable of addressing in this episode, given my professional training, as well as my experience in my relationship, which, by the way, has had its share of toxic dynamics. But in general, overall, I think my relationship could be considered healthy and respectful. And I'm glad I say that because I really want to have the disclaimer that no relationship is perfectly healthy, and also each person's threshold is different. Before I recorded this podcast episode today, I went onto Google and asked this question: how do you know if a relationship is toxic, or how do you know if a relationship's abusive? Which, by the way, those are not the same thing. And I'm going to kind of talk about those two things today. And a lot of what was shared was somewhat ambiguous, in my opinion, and open to interpretation, which makes this really hard to pinpoint into a yes, your relationship is toxic, or no, your relationship is not toxic. It's like we're asking a yes or no question, or we're asking a question that seems to demand a yes or no answer. And sometimes it's really not that simple. It's kind of like asking, is this the one? Or do I love my partner? By the way, I made a masterclass called Watch Your Language. And this is one thing I pointed out, that the nature of the questions that we ask kind of sets the programming for the type of answer we're expecting. And that's why I think it's important to notice what kind of questions you're asking. Now, does that mean that there are no relationships that are healthy and no relationships that are toxic because all of it's relative? Well, it's a spectrum. And everyone, like I said, everyone's threshold is different. So when I hear the words toxic relationship, I have two immediate first thoughts. And I say that this is all my opinion because it's important to not put me on a pedestal and agree with everything I say. Please filter my words through your own personal lens. And if you're really not sure, you can come to me if you really trust me, but also get a second opinion. Speak to a licensed therapist, one that you trust, one that really sees you. I am not the end all be all of relationships. Even if you might look up to my relationship, if you were to see the ins and outs of it, you might cringe a little bit. There's some stuff in there that's unconscious, just like everybody else, I think. Anyway, I had to preface that. Do not put me on a pedestal. I have my flaws. There are times I will miss the mark. I tell my clients this. Sometimes I will invalidate you, not on purpose, but because I'm making an assumption of what I think you said, but maybe you didn't say that and you need to clarify it. I'm human. I missed the mark. Do your research, speak to other people, find multiple truths, and figure out where your truth sits in that. Okay? That said, when I hear about toxic relationships, my first thought is A, abuse, or B, codependency. And by the way, often those two things can go hand in hand, although they are not necessarily the same. So let's talk about what is abuse, okay? So for those of you that are, maybe you kind of know or sense that you're in a healthy relationship, maybe you're not even really thinking about this because your partner treats you with a lot of love and respect, but others of you might have drama in the relationship. Maybe you fight often, and maybe the type of fighting that you have is not fulfilling. Maybe there's more you want to learn, but sometimes you wonder if there's not anything else you can do, and this is just how it's going to be forever. What, in that case, what's abuse? So Google's interpretation and mine are similar. I'm going to share mine. My definition of abuse is when one person exerts power over someone in an unconscious way to the detriment of the other. This can be physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, financial, etc. Now, I put the word unconscious in there because power dynamics done consciously and with consent can be sexy, like BDSM, things like that. If done consciously, power dynamics can be really cool. It can also create polarity. When I do Argentine tango, I am actively surrendering to my partner. And when I go into a follower's position, I have consented to be in a position where the other person has power over me and manipulates my body. That is consensual, and there is an agreement, and it's being done deliberately, intentionally, and on purpose. That is not abuse. Where it's abuse is where it's not happening consensually, and usually the person that is doing the abusing isn't even conscious of what they were doing, because if they were conscious of what they were doing, they would not be doing it. So the unconsciousness is a big aspect to abuse. I also wish I could say that because of that, malicious intent is what distinguishes abuse from intentional power dynamics. But here's the thing. A lot of abusers don't have enough awareness to realize that they're being abusive. More often than not, abusers have been abused themselves. And these coping mechanisms, and what's causing them to be abusive is actually, in a lot of cases, a coping mechanism, meaning they were a victim once and they started standing up for themselves in a more aggressive way, and that allowed them to survive in a dynamic where they were a victim. But now that they're not in that situation anymore, they have not stopped acting that way. And this is how someone becomes a bully in a relationship. And I wish I could say it's malicious intent, but if my definition of abuse is it's unconscious, well, how can there be malicious intent if they are not even conscious of what they're doing? Now, this doesn't mean that I condone abuse. It doesn't mean that you should accept abuse because they have no control over it. I'm just explaining what's going on inside the abuser for those that are curious. It does not mean you need to forgive them. It does not mean that you need to take it. It's for those of you that just want to understand what's going on their side of the street. On your side of the street, it's your right and your obligation to set boundaries to the best of your ability. I understand that for a lot of people, setting boundaries can also be dangerous. If you have an abuser that's intense enough, sometimes setting a boundary is not safe. I'm not an expert on abuse, but from what I understand, people who are in truly abusive situations don't have the luxury of setting healthy boundaries. They almost need to people please in a way that's in a life-preserving kind of way while they figure out their exit plan. I hope if you're listening to this that you are not in that situation. Just while we're talking about the mindset of the abuser, like this is how generational trauma plays out. So maybe a parent was abusive to a child and the child becomes aggressive as a means of getting their energy out and feeling like they have a little bit more power in their lives, and that gave them some sense of self at that time. But now that they're not in a dangerous situation and they're not being abused anymore, that past is being played out in the present. And this is how generational trauma plays out until someone decides to heal it. So again, a definition of abuse is when one exerts power over another in an unconscious way to the detriment of the other. Can be physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, financial, or I'm sure there's others as well, but those were the ones that came to mind for me right away. Now, the paradox is, by this definition, everyone has it in them to be abusive. I have it in me to be abusive. I've been abusive to my partner. I've been abusive to Mother Earth. I've been abusive in my friendships. I've been abusive to my family members. I've been manipulative, right? And in the past, I might have even considered myself, in hindsight, to be an abusive person because I was very controlling and manipulative. I'm not talking about just my relationship with Preston, and although I was, but with other people. And like I said, also to the earth. And in many ways, I still am. I don't actually know how to completely stop taking advantage of the earth and people who are less privileged than I am because I live in a capitalist society and I don't know how to totally detach without being completely detached from the world and society. As I'm recording this, I am reading my notes off my iPhone, which was built by slaves. So although I have developed a lot more awareness around it, and I've changed a lot, I've changed my eating habits, I've changed how I relate to people, I use nonviolent communication, but in many respects, I am unconsciously still abusive, and I have a lot of privileges that other people don't, and I consciously and unconsciously take advantage of those privileges, and I think anyone who has privileges does that. I'm doing my best, but I also understand that it's never enough, and that's true for any privilege that you have. If we know that what abuse is, and we also can know that we all have it in us to be abusive, well, okay, then when do we enter a relationship and when do we leave? Like anything else, there's nuance to this conversation, okay? Now, I talked about my two definitions of a toxic relationship are abuse and also codependency. Let's talk about codependency a little bit. My definition of codependency is where there are no boundaries between self and other. And I don't necessarily mean boundaries in terms of verbal boundaries, which are what you are and are not willing to tolerate. Boundaries are not, I need you to do this. Boundaries are, if you do this, I'm going to exit. You have full permission to be yourself and do whatever you want. However, if you continue to do that, I will be exiting this circumstance. A boundary is not, you need to change. You need to pick up your towels off the floor. You need to stop speaking to me that way. It's merely about what you are going to do. That's a very important distinction, because where you try to control the other, you have not developed a distinction between what's yours and what's theirs. In codependency, how you feel is how I feel. I'm responsible for your feelings and you are responsible for mine. Codependency says you did something and I had a feeling about it, Therefore, the thing that you did caused my feeling. And because you're responsible for how I feel, therefore, you need to change who you are so that I don't feel this way. Believe it or not, this is the norm and how most people communicate today. You did this and made me feel this way, therefore you need to change to fix my feeling. That is how most people relate. That is not a relationship. That is codependency. Codependency is being overly dependent on each other. Not to be confused with interdependency, which again is an agreement. It's consensual. A lot of people who are codependent, they spend a lot of time together and not enough time apart. They actually get anxiety, a lot of separation anxiety, not just separation anxiety in terms of spending time apart from one another, but they also get separation anxiety whenever they're not on the same page about literally anything. The smallest disagreement, the smallest nuance in political opinion, the smallest nuance in how they interpret something, wherever there is a separation of almost egos, where it turns out we're not the same person, we don't see life the same way, and we don't have the same habits and patterns, these are seen as a threat to the relationship. They have confused consensual union with toxicity. I'm not sure that sentence made sense, but you get my drift, I hope. People who are in codependent relationships, they tend to be very controlling and over-focused on the other person's vices. As I mentioned before, I used to be very controlling and manipulative. I have mentioned this before. My husband used to watch a lot of porn. And when I at first found out about this, I would get very paranoid late at night. Now, not so much. If Preston's up late, I know he's not watching porn because he doesn't like how he feels when he watches porn, which is a good enough reason for me to trust that he's not, because it's self-motivated. But sometimes when he's up late at night, I want to cuddle. I'm like, come to bed. There was a point in time where I didn't trust that he wasn't watching porn. And so I would be overly focused on his vices. Is he watching porn? Is he not? We can be overly focused on who they're messaging, who's texting them. If they tend to eat junk food, you might make comments about their diet. We focus more on our partner's unconsciousness than taking a look at our own side of the street. When there's codependency, you can be very frightened of disappointing the other person. And when there is a fear of disappointing the other person, you're more likely to people please and fawn. And as a result of that, because there are no boundaries, because you and me are the same person, and there's no separation, there's a lot of resentment because you don't really get anything that's just for you. So I gave you a little example about the overly focusing on the other person's vices, focusing on my partner's usage of porn, as opposed to maybe things that I could be focusing on, like how much sugar I was eating or how late I was going to bed or whatever. But here's another example of a codependent dynamic. And believe it or not, as you start to understand codependency, you'll start to see it everywhere in the society. As I mentioned, this whole you made me feel this way and you need to change so that I feel better. This is the norm. It's not healthy, but it is. You'll see it a lot. I see it often. And I can't judge because I used to be there with the partner that I'm with now. I used to really want my husband to have a spiritual awakening. I wanted him to be more present. And I thought that if I could just get him to start meditating, or if I could just get him to go to yoga class, then maybe something that the teacher would say would shake him out of his unconscious patterns. And for some reason, I had this belief that if I could get him to read this book or go to yoga, then he would finally change. And then I wouldn't have to feel my uncomfortable feelings. So here's what I would do is I would be going to a yoga class and I would invite him to go to yoga. Say, hey, and I would use these words. And it's important to notice the words that we use. I would say, do you want to go to yoga with me? It's interesting because embedded in that sentence, do you want to go to yoga with me? I am positioning the question as if it's about his desire. Do you want to go to yoga with me? But that's not actually what I'm saying. If I were to be more honest, I would say, I want you to go to yoga with me because I'm secretly hoping that you're going to have a realization that you're unconscious and that you need to change, and you're going to tell me all the things that you've done wrong in the past, and I will finally feel validated. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but because I don't want to say that, I'm just going to say, do you want to go to yoga with me? And just hope that he picks up the message. And of course, somewhere deep down, he understands that this is not a question about his genuine desire to go to yoga. And so he feels deep down that I'm trying to control him, but he is frightened to say his truth. And so he might say, sure. Now, it's so interesting because his mouth uttered the affirmative yes, but his body language and his facial expression said anything but yes. And in the past, I would say, great. And I would plan this thing. And two things would happen. He would either cancel last minute because of a headache or something like this, or he would go to yoga, but he would have a miserable time and barely participate. And in both of these cases where he cancels at the last minute or he goes resentfully and has a terrible time, I resent him a lot. And guess what? He resents me too because he didn't want to go. And to be fair, it's my husband's job to notice his own inner experience, to own and identify and speak his no. That's on his paper. But I'm not speaking about whose responsibility for what today. That's another discussion. What I'm sharing is the dynamic so that if you hear yourself in this dynamic, you can identify with it and know that this dynamic is toxic. If this is the kind of dynamic you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, this is not a healthy dynamic. Does it mean your relationship is not healthy? I don't know. Relationships are relationships, but this dynamic inside the relationship is toxic. There's a bunch of elephants in the room and nobody's acknowledging them, which is if someone feels controlled and one person feels like they have to be controlling in order to get their needs met. No, that's not healthy. You're not crazy. Does it mean you have to break up? Not necessarily. And I'm going to talk about towards the end of this episode what you can do to start to change your dynamic and what to do if the situation does or doesn't improve. To just go back to the yoga class invitation dynamic, what my husband really wanted was permission to say no without any punishment from me and to feel whatever he feels in the moment without my judgment. And also what he wants is maybe he does actually want to go to yoga someday, but he wants to go there not because I told him to. He wants to go there on his own accord, which actually means that I would need to lean back and leave a lot of space for him to come to these conclusions on his own. Now, what I wanted was for him to enthusiastically spend time with me, which is really, I want him to feel a certain way, and you can't make anybody feel anything. But you know, the irony is the only way to get my husband to enthusiastically want to spend time with me is to basically sit and wait. Because as soon as I try to impose my agenda, it's not coming from his free will. And this is very scary. That's really frightening to truly let go of another person because you'll see how they really feel about you. You'll see how truly committed they are. When you lean back and you start focusing on you, do they come running? Or is there just emptiness and they don't come at all after a long period of time? So there's that statement, I've heard it before. If you really love someone, let them go. If they come after you, they're yours. And if they don't, they were never yours to begin with. I do agree with this. And it doesn't necessarily mean breaking up, but I think it's more of an energetic distancing that can happen, especially if we have a tendency, as I mentioned before, to be over-focused on the other person, looking at their vices, constantly texting, controlling, things like this. So I'm hesitant to speak a lot about abuse because for two reasons. Number one, I have not experienced it in a romantic partnership. So automatically that kind of disqualifies me. The only reference points I have to abuse are movies, which I'm sure are distorted, and speaking to people who were in abusive relationships and what I have read in books. Full disclosure. So I'm sharing my opinion. You should definitely listen to a licensed professional speak about this. But because I have a platform and people have asked me about this, I am open to sharing my nuanced opinion. So I say that just to lay down that disclaimer. I don't think it's responsible for me to make a diagnosis of any particular dynamic over a podcast because it's highly individual. Talk to people you trust, get a professional, And know that even the professionals are only telling you what they perceive about your situation based on what you tell them. And perceptions may not always match reality. Professionals, including myself, may merely share our own interpretations based on what you've shared with us rather than observations. I do my best to stay out of interpretations. And what an interpretation is, I think you should leave, or you're in a toxic relationship. That would be an interpretation, but it might not be an objective verdict. So I'm always going to be sharing my subjective opinion. And I think it's important because if I can acknowledge that my opinion is subjective, it means that someone else's subjective opinion might be totally opposite. So it's a limitation. We're always sharing our subjective things. And we can also share observations, which is when I hear your story, here is how I feel. And this is what I think. But just know that this is an opinion and take it with a grain of salt. All right. That said, here are some things that are uncomfortable, but not abusive. Your partner expressing frustration in a heated tone of voice is uncomfortable but not abusive. If they're not throwing things in the moment as a means to intimidate you, because when I think someone starts throwing or breaking things in front of another person, I do believe that can be a form of intimidation, which I believe is abusive because, again, it's an unconscious means to control. A healthy way to work with anger is to maybe say, I feel angry right now. There's anger inside of me. I want to punch the wall. There's an impulse to throw a punch against the wall. I'm sharing that with you not to intimidate you, but to share the extent of my anger. But I have control over it. It's not about, being in a healthy relationship is not about not having a shadow. It's actually being so aware of your shadow that you're in control of it. I don't trust people who say, I never feel anger. I don't trust that. That just means that when you're angry, you don't notice it. That scares the shit out of me. So it's not about not having toxic traits. It's not about not having dark emotions. It's not about no shadow. It's how aware of it are you? This is why I think I actually feel safer saying I have it in me to be abusive than to say I'm the nicest person ever. I'm not. I am toxic AF. I'm more likely to see it as it's coming because I've watched myself engage in these unconscious toxic behaviors in the past. If your partner is saying, I'm angry, I'm going to go to the other room for a moment. I'll be right back in 5 minutes and we'll discuss this more. And then they quietly go rage as a means to process their emotion, not as a means to intimidate. I hope you can sense the difference between punching a wall in a rage cage where you've gone to a designated space to process your anger in the privacy of a safe container versus I'm going to punch the wall hoping that you see it so that you feel scared. Those are two different things. So a partner simply expressing frustration and saying I'm angry and doing it in a heated tone, but also doing it in a respectful way that also leaves room for your feelings, that is not abusive. Another thing that's uncomfortable but not abusive is a partner saying no to something that you asked them to do, or if they said yes, but they didn't follow through and you feel angry and disappointed. That is disappointing. It's unconscious. It's painful. It's not abusive. Your partner having a different perspective also is not a gaslight or even a denying of your reality. You've heard me mention many times that two things can be true. And that is true internally, where you might have one side of you that feels one way and another side of you that feels another way, and they could be polar opposites. This is also true externalized in partnership, which means I feel a certain way, I have a certain opinion, and you have the polar opposite opinion. Sharing those opinions, or even if you're sharing your interpretations of an event that both of you experienced, that doesn't mean that they're gaslighting you or denying your reality. What would be denying your reality is saying you're crazy, that didn't happen, or what you saw is not what you saw, or you're not allowed to feel that way. I've done that though. I don't know that I said those exact words, but I'm not above trying to do a positive spiritual bypass when someone shares something disappointing and you try to say something upbeat to add a little positive spin. That's really shitty, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's abusive. I think if someone is repeatedly telling you that what you see you didn't see, I would argue that would be pretty malicious intent, where someone is deliberately trying to make you think that you're crazy. That would be a gaslight. However, if you share your interpretation of an event and your partner who was at the same event had a different interpretation of the event, that's not a denying of your reality. That's just two different realities that are both true, just two different interpretations. Okay? So just know that two things can be true. My interpretation can be accurate, not accurate, but my interpretation can be a valid interpretation, and your interpretation can be a valid interpretation, and maybe both of them and neither of them are both true, right? So keep that in mind as well. Those were my main ones, but if you have any other examples, what are some other examples? Feel free to share them. I saw an email recently that I follow Esther Perel, and she sent out recently an email called, "Is My Partner Gaslighting Me?" I thought that was such a nuanced, out of left field email, but I loved it because I think a lot of us wonder this. And she said essentially that while she's hesitant to give a yes or no answer to her clients, because lately she wants her clients to come to their own conclusions and make their own decisions, she did say, if you are asking this question, "Is my partner gaslighting me?" something's not right and needs to be changed. And I agree. Because if we're asking this question, we're likely identifying some level of unconsciousness inside of our relational dynamic. Some of it is likely yours, and some of it is likely your partner's. It often takes two to tango. But here's the thing. Either way, in my opinion, the work is often the same, because you can't make another person be different. You can't control another person. You can't make them feel a certain way. You can't make them engage or disengage with certain behaviors. What you can do is start to take matters into your own hands. And this brings me to my final main point, and this is actually what I shared in the Patreon to this question. One of my metrics for a toxic relationship is this: what happens when you start to get happy? Does the relationship get better or worse? So if it takes two to tango and your partner's got some toxic dynamics and toxic ways of relating, it's important that you notice if you have some complementary, compatible toxic dynamics. A lot of people think compatible means it's blissful and there's a nice, happy dance. No, sometimes people can be very compatible in very toxic ways. I have seen this with, people even in my personal life that I know personally. They are in a relationship that is toxic, and yet they seem to complement each other perfectly. One person presses play on an old toxic dynamic and they play out the same exact dance that they've played for years. They know exactly what part to play. I'm going to say this, you're going to get defensive, I'm going to get offended, you're going to get offended that I'm offended, I'm going to go into victim sad mode, you're going to come rescue me, blah, 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 blah. We have the same pattern, we know exactly how it plays out. What happens if your part changes? That's the part I'm interested in. So you're not going to assume that your partner won't change. But what happens if you change and you start taking ownership of your happiness and you start going to therapy and you start going to yoga and you start doing your self-pleasure practice and you start smelling the flowers on your way home from work every day and you start reading books and you start nurturing your social life? Does your relationship get better because you're happier and suddenly because the half of the ingredients in the relationship being you are happier, the whole relationship improves? Does your partner feel safe in your presence now that you're not attacking them? Does your partner soften because you become a safe person? Does your partner feel accepted by you and as a result they are more accepting towards you? If that's the case, you got a healthy relationship that had some toxic dynamics, but you cleaned up your side. Now, the other situation can also happen where you start cleaning up your side of the street and the relationship gets worse. If you have a partner that does not want you to be happy because they want to continue to have power over you, they want to continue to abuse you, and actually you getting happy and you being empowered is a threat to them, you're in an abusive relationship, in my opinion. So that is my metric. What happens when you get happy? Now, there's two nuances that come to mind. I'm sure there are more, but these are the two that come to mind. Sometimes the nature of abusive or toxic relationships can make it hard to take care of yourself. If there's financial abuse, for instance, you might not be able to gather the funds to start going to the gym or getting therapy. If your partner isolates you from your friends and family, it's going to be hard for you to nurture a social life. So I understand that. And that is something you would want to take to a professional if possible, or call a domestic abuse hotline.
This is producer Brendan with the U.S. Domestic Abuse Hotline. 800-799-SAFE. 800-799-7233.
It's also worth noting that when you first start changing your side of a pattern and you start to get happy, your partner, even the healthiest, most well-intentioned ones, may resist at first and wonder what the fuck you're doing. This is also normal. I'm not talking about a normal level of resistance and what are you doing when you first start getting happy. I remember some of the first times when my partner would brace himself in a dynamic, like he would share a truth of his and he would get ready to brace himself from my onslaught. And when that didn't happen, he was like, wait, what? You're not mad at me for saying that? And I'd say, no, it's okay. And your partner might be a bit perplexed. So I'm not talking about a little bit of resistance or them trying to draw you back in a little bit. But overall, if you start to get happy and you start to be more accepting of your partner because you're more accepting of yourself and you're keeping your eyes on your own paper, focusing on what you can control, which is you, not your partner, overall, if the relationship is healthy, the relationship should improve. If the relationship gets worse as a result of you getting happy, in my opinion, that is a toxic dynamic. So I give you these perspectives not to confuse you, but merely to give you some things to think about. In either case, the answer is always save yourself, in my opinion. Sometimes also our partners can be mean and manipulative, but we started it. That's another little caveat. I've been there. In the beginning of my relationship, I went from under communicating and never communicating anything and being very resentful to over communicating and becoming controlling. Now I have learned how to discern between what happened and what I made what happened mean, which, by the way, this is Nonviolent Communication 101. I talk a lot about this in my conscious communication course and also in my Watch Your Language Masterclass, which are both available on my website. I mostly share observations. I use a lot more body language and facial expression, and I say way more with less. And I mean, I use literally fewer words. And I encourage a lot of my clients, especially women who are extremely intelligent and tend to be able to say a lot, and maybe they really want to be heard. And so they will say the same thing 5 times in 5 different ways, hoping that if they just say it the right way, this time their partner will get it. Stop. The more words you use, if you have a hypersensitive or even wounded partner, if you use too many words, it's likely they might start to feel flooded and tune you out, and then you might sense that you need to be louder and more aggressive with your communication. This is Anxious Avoidant Attachment 101. It can be more powerful to use way fewer words, but have more powerful ones. This is why I made the whole masterclass, Watch Your Language, to recommend that you learn how to use richer words. Use words that are more colorful and flavorful so that you don't need to use as many to get across your point. Now my partner listens to me the first time I say something and the only time I say something. Now, a lot of it has been his work. He's had his own work he's done. But I really do believe that these communication tools helped a lot. I learned how to set boundaries in a loving way. So if you want to know what tools I'm talking about, as I said, I did a masterclass called Watch Your Language. It's all about using nonviolent communication. It's about using your body language and your facial expression to communicate in addition to your verbal communication. Did you know 80% of communication is nonverbal? And yet we take the verbal communication stuff so seriously. Your body language matters too. It also covers richer words that you can use. and some tweaks in your language that will make it more likely that your partner is going to respond to you in a healthy way. And my conscious communication course is a bit more in depth. Watch Your Language is, I think, an hour and a half. The conscious communication course will take you a couple of hours, but it covers things like sharing your desires, setting boundaries. I talk a little bit about masculine, feminine polarity in there as well. So I'll link both of these in the show notes. If you go to the pages, you can see these little mini courses and decide which one is going to work best for you at this time. So I'm willing to bet that there's even more nuance that I left out. So feel free to let me know your thoughts over on Instagram. Tell me what I left out. What are some other circumstances or nuances that were not listed, and share them so that other people can see them as well. I also want to mention that I have a Patreon. I know I've mentioned it a few times. One thing I'm doing monthly is I have a little community. I don't know why I said little. It's almost at 100 patrons, which is super cool, where we meet once a month on Zoom and I answer a good amount of questions, the top rated questions, 5 to 7 of them usually. I do an embodiment practice that I typically only reserve for my one-on-ones, my group clients when I do have a group program, and in my online courses. But I realize that these are not always accessible for everyone. So if you want to know what kind of practices I'm talking about, embodiment practices to get you out of your head in a relational context, I'm doing these also in Patreon, 15, 20 minutes sometimes. And we answer questions, and I also have a sharing circle. So people come and they vent for a few minutes about their relationship, or they share what they're going through or what they've learned. It's really powerful. For $5 a month, US dollars, you can view these calls in retrospect on Patreon. For $9 a month, just a few dollars more, you can actually attend them live and you can ask questions. So I'll link that in the show notes as well. And the last thing is, if you want to ask me a question, you can do so on my Wizio. It's kind of my one-on-one pick my brain option without working with me in a one-on-one program. So if you want to ask me anything, I will make you a 7 to 10 minute video response to any question of your choice, addressing as much nuance as I can cram into that time. And you can get my thoughts on a situation. And that's it. I hope you have a great day, and I hope you got lots out of this episode. And I will speak to you in the next one. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I just wanted to let you know that if you wanted to get support from me beyond the podcast, I'm still active in a couple places, just not the podcast and not as much as I was before. I'm still hosting a monthly call on Patreon and sharing little voice notes from my heart in there when something comes up. So it's not as consistent, but I'm still there. And if you want to come on to my community call and ask questions, I am still offering support in that place once a month. So it's $5 to $9 a month, and you get some exclusive content there. The second thing is I'm still selling all of my courses. By far, my most popular one is called Both Feet In. It's for people who are struggling with relationship anxiety, and it teaches a lot of practices that can help you gain more confidence and learn how to tolerate difficult emotions and get alternating parts of you on the same page and rewrite your stories and beliefs about love. Some of these meditations that are taught are partnered meditations, meaning I recommend you find a buddy that's also doing the course. If you need help finding a buddy, you can always email my support team, who is keeping a running list of people looking for sort of accountability partners, even while I'm on maternity leave. And you can email them at support@anxiouslovecoach.com. And lastly, if my Wizios are up, you are always free to submit me a Wizio. This is basically my pick my brain option. And you can pick my brain for $67, or I have like an emergency one for, I think it's $117. And I will make you a short video with my thoughts within the week. So if that's something you're interested in, as long as I have it turned on, it's available. I still plan to check my email. So those are the ways you can still get support. I'm probably not going to be making new podcasts for a little while. I'm not going to be on Instagram as much or writing emails. So if you want to be in contact, this is the way to do it in a way that I think is going to feel really good for me. And with that, thanks so much for tuning in and listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I appreciate you so much for being a listener and a subscriber. Have a beautiful day and a beautiful week and a beautiful life. Talk to you soon. Thanks so much for listening to The Anxious Love Coach today. If you loved this episode, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and maybe share it with someone that you believe might benefit from these perspectives. Please also subscribe to my email list at www.anxiouslovecoach.com, as I'm trying to reduce my reliance on social media. In exchange, you will receive my free relationship anxiety meditation and more supportive tools sent your way. If you would like to work with me, head on over to my website at, again, anxiouslovecoach.com to explore different tiers of coaching options and online programs. Thanks again for listening, and catch you in the next episode. Have a blessed day.